Ross is just getting ready, I'd like to introduce who's up on the panel here today. And we have Ross Nadeau, who's a landscape architect on the project. Jeremy with KEPCO Plus. I was the project manager. We were involved in stone selection and stone supply, and well, choosing the stone, and then the actual installation of the project. On my left here we have Aaron Hicken.
I'm with Delta Stone Products. I've been in the stone industry for about 23 years, since I was 14 years old. From hot tender to mason. Now I'm for the last 15 years old. For the last 15 years, I've been the general manager of Delta Stone Products out of Heber, Utah.
Luke Wilson with Mountain Valley Stone. I've been in the stone industry for about 7 years now. I started out as a purchasing agent and have been moved out to the quarry production manager for the last 5 years.
And I'm Kathy Spanier with Cold Spring. I'm representing Cold Spring on this project. I'm the Director of Marketing. Cold Spring has been in business for over 115 years, and many of you may know that we rebranded last year. Part of the reason is that we're more than a granite company. We do have 30 quarries around the nation and 5 fabrication facilities. But in addition to that, we do some limestone and also bronze and diamond tooling.
Hi, and KEPCO has been in business for almost 30 years. Typically we do architectural cladding. This was a bit of an anomaly for us. As you well know, the last few years you sort of do everything you can do. We have a lot of skilled craftsmen that we needed to keep busy, and this was an exceptional project that happened to be in our hometown of Salt Lake City. So I'd just like to find out who we're talking to over on your side of the fence. So who here is an architect? If you could just raise your hand. Don't be embarrassed. Okay, the back row people, hi. Who are stone installers or do that kind of work? Okay. What other groups of people do we have? Designers?
Fabricators.
Quarriers? Okay. Any other categories?
Stone cleaning.
Stone cleaning? Okay, that's good to know. Anybody else who's not covered in any of those categories? Fabricators? Hi, welcome. So firstly, I'd just like to welcome you all and thank you, and we apologize again for being late, and over to Ross.
Yeah, we were late because we were receiving some awards for the project, so
that's our excuse.
An unfortunate set of timing there, but I know some of you are going to be probably trying to get some continuation credits for this class. There's a room monitor who can help you with that after the session. The objectives for today's session is to discuss the process of integrating stone into the design process from the very beginning to the completion of the project. We'll also be identifying the distinctive roles that members of this team played in the project. We'll also touch on some of the roles that the ownership played along the way. We will also define the role that mock-ups played in this project. There was extensive use of mock-ups from the design phase all the way to completion. And then we'll also be illustrating the importance of the stone supplier and the role that they played in bringing this vision to reality. City Creek Center is our case study for this session, and we've kind of already introduced ourselves, so we'll skip right over that. City Creek Center is located in the Great Basin. It's in Salt Lake City, which is at the foot of the Wasatch Range. The valley there has a population of about 1 million, and the city itself has a population of about 200,000. The site is a 23-acre site, which is 2 blocks, located right downtown Salt Lake City. And it's on the path of the original course of City Creek. City Creek is important to the developer, the Mormon Church. They have a residential development arm called CCRI. And they basically wanted to celebrate the role that City Creek had played in the settlement of Salt Lake City. The pioneering Mormons who settled that valley in 1847 they camped next to this creek during their first year there. And they diverted the water flooded some land, and were able to plant some potatoes, and those potatoes got them through their first winter. Sorry about that.
I woke everyone up, so that's good.
Today, City Creek Canyon is a dedicated open space, and the water from City Creek is still used for agricultural as well as domestic water use. The project site is directly across from Temple Square, which is here. This dark area is the site, and it's also adjacent to the convention center, and it's well served by mass transit. The reason this project came to be was there was a mall with above-ground parking structures on the site, these 2 blocks in red, and the mall was failing. A new mall was built on the other side of town, and the way to revive this portion of town was to remove the failing mall and above-ground parking, and install 4 to 5 levels of below-grade parking, a 2-story mall, as well as a series of renovation of existing buildings, shown here in blue, and 5 new residential towers, shown in yellow. One of the challenges we had designing this project was dealing with the extremely large blocks that are found in Salt Lake City. A typical block there is 650 feet by 650 feet. A city like Portland, Oregon, which is much more pedestrian friendly, you could fit 9 blocks of Portland into one of these blocks in Salt Lake City. So the key was to break up those large blocks and allow cross circulation for pedestrians. This is our final illustrative plan, and you can see, like I just mentioned, there's cross circulation through the site, and the primary feature of the circulation route is a recreation of City Creek. It has creek elements, it has these large cascade elements, and also some oxbow type features. And the developers also wanted to have some of the courtyards populated with more formal and interactive fountains. In the beginning of the design process, the developer told us the history of the creek, told us how important it was to the founding of the area. And they showed us images like this, and they said, this is what they want in this project. And we really struggled when we saw an image like this, and we knew what the program was, 2 stories of retail over a 5-story parking structure. And we really scratched our heads, and they kept sending us pictures like this of the real City Creek. And we started to get a feel of what they were talking about, but we didn't quite understand how we were going to make that a reality. And after a number of initial sketches and them telling us we'd kind of missed the mark, they suggested that we hike City Creek. So the first time we hiked it, it was in the winter. And you can see it's a real creek. It's got rocks. It's got water. Lots of native plant material. We studied it. We started to get a feel for the width and the flows. And even some of the different characteristics like this trout pond up in one of the meadows. And, of course, that means there's trout in the trout pond. And as the design went on, the developer told us not only do they want native plants, they also want real fish, indigenous cutthroat and Bonneville cutthroat trout and brown and rainbow trout within the mall. So when they told us that, we realized that we were a little in over our head. So we hired a botanist to study the real City Creek, and they provided us with essentially a shopping list of what was there, and then an idea of what we could try to replicate within our project. It was very useful, and as we did all of this, we got the comfort level from the ownership that we had finally understood what it was they were trying to do. So we went about schematic design and started to incorporate some of these elements, like this oxbow feature that we had proposed at one time, a fish pond, and of course some of the plazas that would have the more thematic and interactive fountains. So through those early design phases, a big part of this was how wide to make the retail space. How much room do you need to walk? And, of course, the retail developer, Taubman, who partnered up with CCRI, they were very concerned about sight lines to storefronts, cross-shopping. So this idea of the creek going down the middle of the mall was a real challenge to keep both owner groups happy. But we went through the process and kept refining and refining, and we got to the point where we were doing these kind of SketchUp and AutoCAD renderings, Photoshop ultimately, and we got the go-ahead that we had kind of figured out what they wanted, and the next step was, how do we build this? You know, all those pictures you saw of the real City Creek, they featured real stone. All the renderings you saw that we did had stone all over them, paving, seating elements, and of course the water features themselves. And at the same time as this project was going on, downtown Salt Lake City was beginning to realize they needed to really renovate downtown, and they had a program, a master plan called Downtown Rising. And this project was going to be the first project to really kick off Downtown Rising.
So the idea here is that if we set the right kind of tenor for its architecture, its landscape, its quality, its purposeful development, that people in other parts of the city
the director of
do the
architecture
same thing
for CCRI
and carry on that same kind of quality, that same kind of design intent.
Was that they wanted this project to capture and show off the quality that could be done as a redevelopment project in Salt Lake City. This project, they wanted to be kind of the example for projects that followed it to use as far as the permanence of the design and the permanence of the materials.
Can I say something?
You certainly can.
So, two things. One is it was really to set the bar for the rest of the design for the whole of downtown Salt Lake. That's what Ross is saying. The other part we didn't actually introduce was that we're going to have a discussion at the end of this, so that at the end, if you have any questions, feel free to write them down or whatever, and we'll discuss them at the end. But we're really going to have a panel conversation at the end that involves the whole conversation of stone selection and everything like that, where we would love to get questions from you guys. So it's occurring maybe that it's a very formal presentation, but actually it gets more informal as we go on. So I just wanted to put that in as well. So feel free to write down any questions you have, any other projects or whatever you want to ask questions. That's at the end, okay? So go ahead.
Thanks. So as designers on the project, we knew we were going to be using stone now. We had that budgetarily wise, it was signed off by the different developers. So we went out to Utah and we started to study and learn what stone material was regionally available. And this is an example of most of the readily available material near Salt Lake City. The five samples on the left side of this image, turned out that those were not really good candidates for the type of water features and paving that we were going to be doing. Either it wasn't available in large enough sizes, or it wasn't conducive to the freeze-thaw environment that we'd have. So we kind of narrowed it down to the three on the bottom. The one on the right was too red for a lot of us on the design team. And since we needed to have these naturalistic boulders, we basically fell into the Mountain Valley Stone quarry. And so we went up to that quarry and we started to learn which types of forms that material can take, whether it's flagstone. Other regionally available material was cobble, and it was used extensively on the project. This is some river cobble. We also had monolithic blocks that we used for seating. This particular stone came from Wyoming. In addition to the more informal naturalistic elements, we did have some formal elements with more architectural character to them, and we turned to Cold Spring to select those stones. And these stones were also used on many of the buildings that were throughout the project. So we studied, in addition, different ways we could treat the material, bush hammering, thermal finishes, etc. And in the end, the 5 different architects involved on essentially these 13 different buildings that become this one thing known as City Creek, we developed a palette that worked across the entire 2-block site. There was one challenge we had with kind of fine-tuning the final selection, and I think, Aaron, you can add a little bit to this challenge.
So when we did this, when they started honing in on what type of stone they wanted to use, there was a variety of granites. There was our quartzitic stone that we've been providing and recommending. And at the time, we always referred to our stone as a really hard sandstone, and that seemed to really cause a lot of problems because we call it sandstone, because the first thing that they always hear or think of when they hear sandstone is, the Grand Canyon, Arches National Park, these places that have a lot of soft stone that, will literally wash away under the right conditions. And so we were forced, in a way, to provide a lot of stone testing to prove what we already knew our stone was capable of. Our Mountain Valley stone had been around and been quarried for well over 100 years in Park City, where freeze thaw is brutal. Sometimes you'll go through 2 or 3 cycles a day because of the weather conditions, and so we knew it would do it, but we had to prove to the owners that our stone was as good as the other alternates they were looking at.
Yeah, and in particular, some of the members of the Taubman team, the retail developer, they basically said, oh, no, you never use sandstone horizontally. You only can use it on the sides of buildings. Right. And so we did in the end show that the Mountain Valley stone was really a contender. It was able to withstand this use. The image I showed earlier of that retail corridor, the primary Galleria space of the mall, there was a lot of back and forth between the CCRI arm of our client and the retailer Taubman side of our client. We went from 30 foot wide to 45 feet wide, and we kept changing what that was, and we changed whether the creek was 5 feet wide or 6 feet wide or 7 feet wide. And it became so uncertain with everyone that once we had something that we thought was going to work, we decided, well, the clients decided, we better mock it up before you guys go further into design to prove that it'll work. And so on a remote site, we built a 50-foot long, 35-foot wide example of what would be the primary condition through the center of this retail center. It included these cast iron bridges, which would address the retailer's desire for cross-shopping. And it included all the different paving patterns that we were developing during this design development phase. Even experimented with a couple of the different materials. We included the light poles and the planting and the boulders and the slot drains and the drainage elements for these trees. These trees are aspen trees that really shouldn't be living down in the valley, but we were able to find a grower that was low enough that we could use that plant material on this site. We also had the advantage of using this mock-up, which was really a design test mock-up, to flesh out some of the design elements as far as detailing of the stone, like how we were going to treat the edge, how we would incorporate this riparian plant material that was required in order to have a habitat that would support the fish. Once this mock-up was completed, we had about 30 different representatives between the church and Taubman come out, and we even put fish in this mock-up. We ran it for a day with fish in it, and we left there knowing that we had something that would work. So then the next challenge, in addition from that mock-up, was Taubman was very concerned again about the sandstone. That issue kept coming back up, and they kind of got away from it can't handle the freezing because of the data we showed. But then their concern was what happens when you spill ketchup on it or mustard or chocolate. And so we ended up doing another mock-up in front of one of the existing towers that wasn't really affected by this development. And for about a month, they let the pedestrians walk back and forth across this, and they tested out these different sealers. They ended up settling on the Prosoko after this. And so since the stone was really locked in now, SWA needed to become educated about how to detail this stone and its limitations or abilities. So we went up to the quarry and spoke with Luke.
And this is where SWA was really great to work with. They came out and they had a desire to learn exactly what we could do with the boulders. They came out, I don't know how many hundreds of times to look at boulders, climb through the boulder piles. The quarry is a boulder quarry. We don't have any real consistency in our boulders. Our boulders could be fist size, and they could go anywhere up to a size of 400 to 500 tons apiece. So we don't have that consistency in the boulder sizes, but they were willing to come up, sit down, talk, and freeze to death, because this was all going on during the winter time. So if anybody's been to Utah, you know that it will be cold. So with the boulder quarry, we do very little blasting. The quarry has been around for over 100 years. It's been used all over in Park City, any Utah area, and has done extremely, extremely well with the freeze-thaw, something that the clients weren't quite sure of, but we had the data, like Ross has said, to prove that it would last with this application. So you can see through some of this, the boulders and the sizes of them.
That's snow. That's snow.
So some of the challenges we get as we go through the quarry will come along the big boulders. Some of the boulders can be up to 10 to 15 feet tall and weigh well over 100,000 pounds. And the way we deal with that is we'll go in and we'll plug and we'll feather it, and we'll use some expandable material that overnight will expand the rock and split it in half.
Lifting up to 24 tons, and at times we have to use 2 or 3 of those to roll some of the boulders around so that we can use an expanding concrete in them. We'll drill them, put the concrete in them. During the winter it takes 2 to 3 days. During the summer when we drill and split them, it'll usually take a day. So that's our method of breaking them down into more usable product.
So with the knowledge that we learned about how to work with this particular stone, the next step was to complete the design. So we used all the normal tools that architects use, CAD. We built a series of models, including these 3D printed models that initially were very rough. It was more of a volume mass kind of study. Ultimately, we did refine this down to full 3D dimensional drawings for each one of the individual boulders. And you can see here there's some models that we used not only in the design process to get the ownership to sign off, but we ended up using these models out in the quarry to help find boulders that could become these individual pieces. During the design process, the ownership would come in every now and then and review things. Oh, well, you know, I want a better sight line into the food court, and we would have to adjust the model. And every time you go into a 3D printing process, it's a little time-consuming and fairly expensive. Each one of these rectangular models is about $12,000 to $15,000. So we started changing the pieces out of foam or out of balsa wood rather than keep reprinting it, because we had continual changes to it as we were finishing the design. And we also ended up finding particular boulders out in the quarry that maybe didn't quite fit what we had modeled, and so we would reshape boulders out in the quarry and then change the model again to reflect that. There were a lot of boulders for this project. I think it was 367, if I remember correctly.
In the fountains, but there were over 800.
Yeah, including the creek beds, yeah.
Special.
And we worked very closely with KEPCO on the selection process. And why don't you speak to that a little bit, Jeremy?
Yeah. This photo here is a fairly good representation of some of the coloring you can get in this natural stone, and that was one criteria that we discussed with Ross, was getting colors of stones that actually match together, so that when you put them all together they looked and occurred as being natural. The other part was that the direction of there's actually a bedding plane to this rock, and when you look at this outcrop here,
so the boulders that we used on City Creek came out of this quarry here at Delta Stone, and the stone that comes out of this quarry is a sandstone, a quartzitic sandstone that has got these bedding planes that, in order to make the feature on City Creek look more natural, as if it was there before the project was built, we made sure that all of the boulders that we installed have the bedding planes in the same orientation.
It then correlated back towards the model. And as Ross was saying, if you look at the models down here at the front, we actually used these models to, this is a 1/4-inch scale model down here, and you'd be walking around with a little piece of plastic like this looking for a boulder that could roughly represent what you were looking for, so that when you put them all together they would fit. So that was part of the challenge for us. This is down outside of the fabricator's shop. As you can see, horrible view here of one of the mountains in Utah. But yes, it was all through the winter months, and coordination was an important part of that. So Luke wants to...
And part of the process as we were out there selecting these boulders was Jeremy, Ross, we would come out, we would have a bunch of boulders selected for them, and we would come out, we would tag them with our tags of what sizes they were supposed to be, and then we would photograph them, and the boulders come out of the ground. I mean, the quarry is anywhere from 200 to 385 feet deep. So coming from that depth to the surface as we were digging and pulling them out, they're wet, so they're still green, so they haven't seasoned and dried out yet. And a process that we would do with them was we would take them, bury them under anywhere from 6 to 8 feet of soil to try and keep the moisture from freezing and cracking the stone. So as you can see in that other picture, that one had a giant crack in it, and sometimes it worked for us really good and sometimes it wouldn't. Sometimes we would pull them out and then we'd have to frantically try and find a new boulder that was that size for them to look at.
And this is something that I had never even thought was an issue, that you can't just take a boulder out of the middle of the earth, if you will, and just bring it up and start using it, and that things like this big crack of a boulder that, Jeremy and I would almost know these boulders by name at some point. And it's like, oh no, we lost H4, and so then it's back to the hunt. So the seasoning was something new for me.
Okay, this is what's known as the flagging process. This is the material that was used in the creek side that Outside the Lines purchased. As you go through this process, you'll see that we're high grading this into 1-inch material, 1.5-inch material, 3-inch and 4-inch material. As we go through and we plug and feather this is a traditional method that's been used thousands of years. As you go through it, when you split, you'll find that you have to look, listen, and feel as you're splitting the stone. So the quarrymen, as they go through the process, they're watching to know which plug or feather to hit next, because you don't always go in order. You may jump over one to get to another one.
So these guys are really crafted at what they do, and that was part of the process as we made the material for the creek beds and the different boulders.
And one of the things we learned was that, we were showing drawings where we had 2-inch pieces of flagstone that were maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, and we quickly learned that that wasn't very realistic, and we got our thicknesses and our actual available size dialed in during this design development process. So as we...
the stones were actually brought here from the quarry. Here's a sample of the stone that was used, and some of the boulders were so big that as they came into the warehouse here, there was just one boulder on a truck, and although the finished product may only be 7, 8, 9, 10 tons, some of the boulders we actually used to cut the stone from weighed up to 25, 30 tons. So as always, for people who aren't necessarily involved in stone or stone supply or installation, it's sometimes easy to forget how heavy things are. And some of the boulders that we will bring down from the quarry, you're getting one rock, one boulder on a truck at a time. That's how big they were. The picture, actually, that picture is hard to see, but ultimately, the models were also used to create, and we created an AutoCAD version as well of these models for design purposes, but each of those boulders had between 1 and 10 cuts on them to create the view that from the front of the water feature, once it was complete, it looked like a solid stone, massive stone, but in reality, the City Creek development is sitting on 5 stories of parking, like Ross mentioned, and so weight was an extremely important part of the whole design. And on these boulders, we're talking about sort of 8 and 9 inches as a thin veneer, and some of the boulders weighed up to 7 or 8 tons. So that was an important part of it. In the layout and cutting each boulder individually to create it so that it actually fit over the concrete substrate was an important part of the design, and the tricky part as well, because as you can imagine, every boulder was never exactly how it was dimensioned to be in the model.
And this presented a challenge as the fabricator. Typically you don't have your customer come tell you how to cut your rock. Typically there's cut tickets and drawings, and you cut you cut based on what you're trying to get. And in this case, because how everything had to come together, Jeremy would come in and he'd lay out the stone. This is a custom turntable we built in our big saws. Those are 12-foot diameter blades. And we built this because every boulder had between 1 and up to 10 cuts that were not at all ever perpendicular or parallel. And so this aided in speeding up the cutting process, and it made a huge difference in quality and accuracy as we were cutting it. And one thing that would happen is they'd be out on the mock-up, which he'll show here in a second, but Jeremy'd come in right before we were about to cut a boulder, because we were cutting it as they were building it, and as this thing evolved, he'd come in and be like, wait, we got to move it an inch. And our operators were just almost pulling their hair out. But luckily we had a good team, and we all worked together, and it went really well.
And as you can see here, that's probably, that's an 8,000-pound boulder that now only weighs 1,500 pounds. Most of the rock is actually being cut away to leave the natural face on the outside. And that L shape there on the left of the boulder would actually be, if we turn this boulder up the other way, would actually present itself as a natural looking solid boulder, but in reality 3/4 of it's actually been cut away. I'll go again. Fine. The mock-up that Aaron was just talking about, there's 2 parts to engineering design, particularly in Salt Lake, and one of those is the fact that it's actually in a seismic area, and that because of that seismic movement, each of the areas that Ross was talking about actually met, the different buildings and different parts of the buildings actually met and had movement joints, and believe it or not, ended up right in the water feature, that we've got these big 6-inch movement joints that we actually had to accommodate and allow for in the actual water feature itself. The other part was, as you can see here, that you're talking some seriously large boulders and needing to be restrained so that if there is an earthquake, the boulders stay where they are and don't tumble down. This is just in a mock-up detail, because on the actual mock-up we were just using them just to purely hold them in place from a gravity perspective. But typically, you're talking 6,000 or 7,000 pound boulders with a 50-pound attachment system and anchor bolts that cost $70 each. So again, that all had to be waterproofed and detailed and coordinated carefully between us and the installers.
Another very big challenge on this project was the schedule. There was a date that was established that the retail center needed to open, and because of the complexity of a lot of these stone elements, in particular these large cascades, it was determined by ownership, the general contractor, and the subcontractors that there really wasn't the ability to build this on site one time during the construction schedule. So it was agreed that a mock-up, dry fit mock-up of the entire cascade would be built up near the fabrication facility. So a replica of the structure was constructed about an hour and a half away from the actual project site, and once that structure was completed, KEPCO began installing the boulders.
Yeah, a lot of snow.
And it was kind of like a first install. These are the very first 4 that went in. And I remember the day that I was called up to review this with Jeremy and talk about this idea that we're going to just have a butt joint between these stones.
Right.
And the challenges that would present.
For a company that typically does cut stone and down to 16th inch dimensions, all of a sudden to be involved in a project where you want everything to look natural and to tell your guys that if they chipped the corner off, it didn't actually matter for the first time in their whole lives. As you can see, that very first mock-up there, if you can just go back a slide, there's some big corners missing off those stones and nothing sort of really lines up, and there was a lot of discussion as to how natural we wanted that all to look, and ultimately it was the end result that was the most critical part. So each of those rocks were actually trimmed down and the corners were knocked off and the boulders were lowered down, and you can see actually standing there that the gaps have all disappeared and the right-hand stone got rejected because it was the wrong color. But it was a big learning curve for all of us that to create something that actually looked half natural and in the end very natural was going to take some craftsmanship. And a lot of discussion went on as to the actual joint size between boulders, and I don't think we're quite up to the Inca scale of, you can't get a $100 bill between these stones, but ultimately, most of the joints are down to the 1/4 to 3/8 dimension, which when you're dealing with 7,000 or 8,000 pound natural boulders was quite the challenge. Here you can see the kind of shapes of the boulders as they were stacked up, and it's starting to get a fairly natural look. Again, there was a lot of coordination between the quarrier, between Luke and Aaron and I and Ross, and there was a lot of conversations that we were tweaking things and chipping things off to make it look more and more natural. So, but it's big. It's a big mock-up.
And one thing we had to do as we were producing this with KEPCO is we'd get the boulders in a day or so before we cut them, and they wouldn't be able to lay them out till the day before we cut them, because they didn't know what they needed yet, because it was this ever-evolving animal. And
the ownership also played a very active role, much more active than I've had on other projects. We were about maybe a third complete with this mock-up, and ownership said, "We want to see water flowing over." I was like, "We're not done yet," And they said, "No, we want to make sure this is going to look right." And so Aaron was able to work with the local fire department.
Yeah, Jacobson, the contractor, came to me. He's like, "What are we going to do?" I'm like, "Well, we'll get you water." And so we called the local fire department, and they were way excited to bring out their new toys that have really probably never been used in real life. And so we pumped water up on here, and we were able to, in a small scale, recreate what the water was going to do. Ultimately, we ended up going a different way because they wanted to see water on a more regular basis.
Yeah, this was the first water test that we did, and again, much earlier than we wanted, but it was an opportunity for the owners to give us some feedback on, whether the flows were right and the texture of the boulders and everything. They were, like I say, very much hands-on throughout this process. There's a series of videos here of some of these early tests. This is when we ended up using rain cooling. We had 2 big pumps, and we were pumping approximately 2,500 gallons per minute over the cascade. And we did this about 5 or 6 different times as we got further and further along.
Those are my kids. Not climbing on the rock.
With the process. And every time we would turn this thing on, they would come up, the different owner groups, and they would, tweak that one, add a boulder. And of course that rippled effect back on the it actually went down to the project site. I think there's 1 or 2 more videos in here real quick of the water. So the mock-up is fine-tuned and signed off by the ownership groups, and then the next step in the process was to disassemble it and bring it down to the project site. So here's that same structure, but this time the permanent one, down in Salt Lake City. They've got the waterproofing on there, and the cascade, this particular cascade, is located kind of in the middle of the block. And I know that the general contractor had some challenges there, and why don't you speak to this part, Jeremy?
Yeah, from an installation perspective, we actually were involved heavily with the general contractor in actually the crane selection as to how on earth they were going to get these huge boulders into the middle of this job site, bearing in mind that you're on 5 levels of parking, and you can't drive a forklift anywhere. It's a very small one.
This is a 6-foot-tall man. That's a 5-foot-tall rail for the rail crane.
So it was decided to put this rail crane in, and the rail crane supported by individual structural members that were actually poked up through the slab down to the structure below. But even so, this crane had like a 12,000-pound maximum lift capacity. And, you know, we had a boulder that even then we still had to cut it in half just so the crane could pick it up.
And this crane wasn't just for the boulders. It was for the rest of the architecture being constructed at the same time. So there was a lot of jockeying for crane time.
Yeah, I mean, there was arm wrestling going on, actually. But ultimately, that crane did its purpose, and we were carefully coordinated with everyone else. As Ross said, the schedule was very tight. On site, we had almost just over 6 weeks to install what had taken us over 6 months to build out in the field. Each of the boulders, as they were dismantled from the mock-up in Heber up by the fabricator, was then loaded on, it's not shown here, but was actually loaded onto a steel frame so that the steel frame could be lifted up and over the other buildings so that we knew it would be safe, because chains have the possibility of slipping on boulders and things like that. This pitch is actually just moving it locally from when it had been unloaded from one of the metal frames onto and installed into the actual water feature itself. Here, again, you can see another boulder that's been burrowed into, as we say, and it actually spanned over one of these big seismic joints, so it was able to, we were using the boulders to hide the joint underneath.
Yeah, and these seismic joints not only ran horizontal, they also ran vertically, and sometimes both at the same time, like this one. And it posed a challenge for us aesthetically how to treat these. It was a slow process, but we did develop some techniques with sealant, and this isn't the finished product, but ultimately we did some faux painting and carried the colors and textures from the adjacent rocks over this sealant. And yet again, the owner was very anxious to see the water turned on, so we're not done with the fountain yet. The pumps just came on in the fountain pump room, and they said, yep, let's turn it on. Let's see how the water's going to flow. So they came out to the site all the time.
So we haven't really shown you a lot of pictures of the whole City Creek development, but the water features, both these natural ones and the ones we're going to get to in a minute, were a big, almost a tourist attraction when the thing opened, and they still are, that people actually come to see. It's hard to appreciate really how big that waterfall is. You've got an 18-foot drop there, which, you know, for any building, that's a large cascade to create. There are other cascades as well on the project, and also some fixed water features that Ross will get to in a minute. But
yeah, so let's talk about the formal water features. SWA collaborated with CMS, a fountain consultant, and through the schematic and DD process, we were the team that developed these fountains. And we kept refining them, and ultimately what we ended up with was a children's interactive pop jet fountain, which is the smaller circle, and then a water table that had programmable lighting and water that at this time was not really going to be a themed event with music, but it was going to be a very interactive and programmable water feature. These are some of the early concepts of that and renderings. As it turned out, the church decided that they really wanted to have a world-class fountain, and they came to WET, who developed the Bellagio fountain, among others, to develop unique, never-seen-before type nozzles and effects for this project. And we'll have some video later on of what those ended up like. And again, we used the traditional tools when we were in the development stages of the design, clay models, as well as laser cut models. And then ultimately we did turn back to 3D printing. At first it was just to kind of get a comfort of the scale and the volume of these elements, but ultimately we used the 3D printing to start to really define the mechanical spaces that would be required for the source basins and return basins. We also, kind of right at the end of our role in the DD process, did some studies of different ways to treat the transition from the water feature to the pavement. This was a great study that was later not used. In the process of developing the design for the fountain, it was agreed to by the ownership that they wanted a contrasting color from the paving that the rest of the plaza has. And so they turned to some of the color palette and stone types that were used in the architecture. And Kathy can speak to this.
Yes. This is our granite. It's carnelian granite, and we're showing it in a rub and sand finish. And the next photo is kind of the tapering effect that you're going to see on the fountain. So this is a sample of that. And then this is a CAD drawing, which in the next is converted to a 3D model. We used Inventor, the software. But you can kind of see the complexity of this fountain that we were going to fabricate. And we also, I said earlier, we have a bronze foundry. There were some difficulties in sourcing the bronze. So we were able to come to the aid and actually pour some sheets of the bronze, and then using our stone cutting techniques with water jetting, we were able to form the pattern that they needed. This is the actual quarry. It's in Millbank, South Dakota, about 120 miles west of our facility. So it has, unlike Luke's quarry here, it's a ledge quarry. So basically, it's a drive-in quarry that we mobilize all of our equipment into the quarry to cut using diamond wire and freeing the stone from the ledge. And then this machine tips that into the loaf. The loaf can be anywhere from 10 feet long by 5-6 feet high and wide. So you'll see this. Okay, tip.
Nice little struggle to pull that block
there we
over.
Go. It's always an exciting moment for people that come to a quarry. That and the blasting. And there's not, actually the blasting in our quarry is very, very minimal. We use the diamond wire cutting to minimize the fracturing of the stone. So in these photos, this is the loaf, and we're looking at it. We want to be able to carry through the design intent for the designer, so we have to cull out areas. We wet it down to see the markings, the natural markings of Mother Nature, and then this gets cut into blocks. And then it gets transported to Cold Spring, the fabrication facility. And this animation is to show you kind of the complexity we were working with. It's kind of a ramp and twist of the material, so it's not slabbing it flat. We had to slab it very cubical. And you can kind of see the things that we were challenged with in terms of cutting and profiling this design, these different pieces. And they also had to match up. We use a lot of automation in our processing, fabrication, so we use that, a lot of 5-axis saws, single wire cutting, machining to get this actual profile. That's one of the pieces, and as you can see, I'm going to go through a couple steps, but the first step was to just single wire cut it to get the profile, and then it's going to take another couple steps, but you'll see even in the mock-up it's not even completely cut. So, Ross, yeah. This would be...
Sorry.
I'm representing Cold Spring.
I hear it's 5,000.
Did it through other conventional methods. The other thing is the technology also allows us to be a little bit more precise in our cutting and matching up pieces. And as you can see, when you have that warp or that ramp and twisting, it was really critical, even with the tapering that we had, to be able to match up these pieces. Our goal is to eliminate any site work when it gets to KEPCO.
And to that end, you guys dry fit the pieces together at your facility before they're shipped.
This is a dry fit, and KEPCO was actually out to our site for this mock-up and approved it. And you can see the other finish that was used was a polish, and you'll see it as it's installed as well. But on that piece, it still has to go through another cut in the back so it can fit and accommodate the fountain. This is the actual finished piece of the bronze that we were able to work through.
The bronze was used where we ultimately wet ended up adding fire to this feature, and the bronze was used adjacent to the fire nozzles. So again, the whole project's on structure. So we're still over a 5-story parking structure. There's actually a 3-foot interstitial space that you can see with this little 3-foot high wall. That's where the fountain is going to go. And that void space underneath the finished surface of the paving was there to accommodate the different mechanical systems for the fountains. Where we had planting, it also gave us a soil zone for our plant material. And as the material arrived on site, KEPCO did the installation.
As I mentioned earlier, one of the tricky parts for us was the fact you couldn't drive a forklift anywhere on the job, so there was a lot of manhandling of the material to move it into position, and we used small gantry cranes for installation with electric hoists, as you can see here. Seems like whenever we're doing these jobs, it's always installation in the wintertime, but that's just how it goes. Here you can see, I mean, there was 175 holes in this that all had to be, systematically and accurately positioned so that the nozzles actually came up in the middle of the holes. And it's sort of very close to completion picture. That's the fire nozzles where the brass inlay went. But here you can start to see the critical nature of how things needed to match up to present the rippling effect needed for the water to flow evenly over these surfaces. Again, in the end, it was decided that rather than putting a grating around the fountain, that these stones would actually be cantilevered out via, again, stainless steel anchorage so that people could actually get up closer to the fountain itself. This is the transition between the stepping part, and then there's another part of the fountain where there's actually an overhang. And as Kathy said, the finish on the stone is also altering. The steps are actually quite small. They're only about 1.5 inches high. And then on the other side of the fountain, you've got this overhang, and water feature to be exact, because you're talking about only 3/16 of the thickness of water flowing over that area. For people to walk up and put their hand in it, because it's really hard to tell that's really water. In this next video you can see some wet finishing pads and just going in if there was any little bump here and there just to smooth those out. But the end result is actually it's amazing how thin that film is. Over to you, Rob.
The water feature is programmable, and throughout the day it kind of changes what it does. In the middle of the day, this is when it does its big exploding high shooting jets. And then during the evenings, on regular schedule, the fountain will go through its different shows. And there's a 20-minute piece of music. Enjoying the water show. As it turned out, this was one of the most successful parts of the project, and as Jeremy said earlier, I was talking to one of the mall managers, and he says, you know, people come here and they think it's Disneyland. They don't even come here to shop, they just come to watch the water features. Yay! Some of the other water features that use the same Cold Spring stone are these reflecting basins that are on alignment with some planters on the Temple Square site. And these are pretty simple arching jet elements that, again, had some brass components that needed to be tightly coordinated. WET also designed another very unique nozzle for one of the other fountains that has turned out to be a little problematic because any wind will carry the water outside the basin, but I'm sure they're kind of working out the kinks in that. Of course, since the project's called City Creek, the creek is the main component of the project. And it's 1,300 feet long, and there's 37 feet of elevation change from the upper left to the lower left, or upper right to lower left. That sounds better. Along that creek, we had these monolithic stones that were used as benches, monolithic pieces of stone that kind of act as the oxbow, where the water would carve out its oxbow shapes. Again, we're on structure, so everything is built up from the deck to accommodate the creek element. Again, I think we mentioned there was a lot of fighting over crane time to bring in these components.
For the creek bed, we did probably 90% of those deliveries between 2 and 3 a.m. That was the only time they'd give us crane time.
Yeah, this is one of those rare days where they let you bring some in during the day. And there was a lot of material used in the creek, not just the large boulders, but cobbles and flagstone as well. And we went constructing straight through. It's probably -10 when this picture was taken. They tended the workspace, provided heaters. When necessary, heated blankets were used, make sure things weren't curing out incorrectly. And it was a real challenge working with the different masons who are more accustomed to architectural dimensional stone to get these more free-flowing, naturalistic type installations. And yet again, as soon as we can, we turn the water on, the owner comes out and starts saying, well, I wanted the water deeper over here or shallower over there. So we kept tweaking elements as we went along. The fountains and cascades, they interface directly with the architecture in quite a few locations, so that was yet another challenge. And of course, we needed to accommodate the fish habitat, so there were certain criteria for the makeup of the cobbles that were used in the creek. These fish are actually in their third generation. It's a successful habitat. The fish are reproducing. Another piece of the puzzle here was a water wall element. They wanted to screen this information kiosk from the trout pond. And so we worked with the gentleman here on the stage and developed this kind of battered water wall that, again, we did a dry fit mock-up and took the owners out there and made sure they were comfortable with the path that the design was taking. Again, a fairly complex fountain system. Series of different weirs at different elevations and different widths. I don't know if you've got any comments about the challenge on building this one.
I think the biggest challenge was this one, as it was a surprise to all of us.
Came late in the game.
Came very late in the game, and it was, but, you know, gratefully we were able to pull it off.
And I personally was resistant to this because this was our trout pond. I didn't want this kind of more animated piece in what was going to be this very naturalistic corner of the project. But as it turned out, it's a beautiful feature, and the fish actually love to congregate right at the base of this waterfall because of the extra aeration that the water has there. Another piece of the puzzle for the creek is the terminus fountain. This one is the primary entry to the site from the south. And we have an escalator that's going to be constructed here on the left of this image, a grand stair, and then next to that grand stair is another cascade. And this also area serves as a entry plaza to a residential tower. This site was right on the edge of the project, so delivering the stone, we could pull the trucks right up near to this one, so a tower or rail crane wasn't required. It was also the second of the big features constructed, so the masons had kind of gotten a sense of what I was looking for, and the process went much more quickly. And in fact, I think there's more boulders on this one than the big Cascade, even though it only has an 8-foot drop compared to the 16-foot drop. And here we are again, tightly interfacing with the architectural facade. Here we are doing the water test, and a lot of fine-tune adjustments. The water element you see at the bottom was introduced because the residential tower there wanted to have something on axes. And there's another shot of that, and I can't remember, you said I was really demanding on this particular boulder?
I mean, this particular stone's like, wasn't it like 18 feet long? And it had to be 4 to 5 feet tall, and I mean, and the quarry that we got, this particular quarry, just, it was a very rare.
It was a rare find.
Yeah, it was very special.
I guess in the whole project, one of the things from a KEPCO perspective is it's a bit like Aaron said. I mean, the interaction between us in the selection and the layout process, it was the exact same. Typically, we don't go out and select our own boulders. We order them. And working a lot with Ross, basically for a year, he spent driving up and down the canyon. I put 30,000 miles on my car that year, just driving up to the quarry during the selection process almost every day, because you're always hopeful that the next boulder coming out the quarry was the one you were looking for. And with this many boulders you're looking for, it's more of a war of attrition in finding the right boulder to go in the right spot than it is actually. You sort of stumble across one, and after a while, like Ross says, you know, you're looking for H3 or whatever the code was that we had for it, and if you found it, it was almost like you got on the phone and celebrated, because it was really, like I said, there were a lot of boulders to find, and after a while you sort of got them in your head, and you'd wake up in the middle of the night sleeping, and but the end result, I think, is very natural, and as Ross is showing you here, this is the headwater detail.
This is where the water first appears on the site. And it was a challenge. Initially, we were just going to have kind of a pile of rocks and a spring bubbling forth from that pile of rocks. But as it turned out, on the surrounding residential buildings, you could look down and see that bubbling source, and it didn't look good seeing the valves and whatnot. So we ended up with this kind of water bubbling forth from these two boulders, and it worked out. In addition to the creek and the cascades, we also used the Mountain Valley Stone on the roof gardens. There's 3 stories of for-rent residential over the retail center, and they each have some amenity decks, and we use that stone for veneer and cap. And in addition, one of the plaza's roof gardens, we incorporated these brick walls as well. The other large component of the project using stone was the paving. All of the paving on the site is stone, except for this one roadway here, this little alley, which is the valet drop-off lane. We went through a series of different studies on where we would break up the pattern and which material would be used where. And unfortunately, as we discussed earlier, you know, even though the Mountain Valley stone, the quartzitic stone, tested out fine with the sealer and tested out fine with the freeze thaw and all the other criteria, we never got over that hump that it was called a sandstone at one time. And so the Taubman developer just said, no, it can't be sandstone, even though we proved that it would work. So we ended up using China granite for most of the paving. In addition to the freeze thaw concerns, the ownership wanted to have easy access to the snowmelt tubing. Traditionally, you cast that into the subslab or you put it within mortar. Here we developed a 12-to-1 sand cement mix. We had to mock up a couple of different ratios to figure out the perfect one. But they wanted to be able to lift up the sand set pavers and just kind of dig away with a screwdriver almost. In fact, I think that's what we used in this little picture, to have easy access in case a leak occurred in the snowmelt system. There were 5 different paving contractors on the project, and each one was required to provide a mock-up. And these are a series of different images of those mock-ups. And the mock-up would be dismantled to determine whether or not the contractor had used the material correctly. This is a polymeric sand that has not been wetted properly. Essentially, it rained the day that they were doing it, and they kept doing it, and it didn't work. Verifying that we had the minimum or maximum loose sand setting bed. Here's an example of the polymeric sand joint sand being properly installed. This was kind of our magic sandwich across the whole site. The piece down at the bottom represents the structure, and then we have the waterproofing, the drain mat, galvanized mesh to hold the tubing in place. There's a lot of memory on that tubing, so they need to use that system. And then that's encased with a 12-to-1 sand. We have a minimum of ½ inch, maximum of 1 inch of loose setting sand, and then, of course, the 2-inch paver on top. All of the paving system, like I said, was on structure, so they would get the waterproofing down, they would flood test it, go to town installing all of this snow melt. They had some challenges getting the snow melt across the slot drain. We used slot drains wherever we could to eliminate the valleys and ridges. And we also had cleanouts for these slot drains, which, of course, we wanted to disappear, so we made sure that the paving pattern went uninterrupted through these, which, of course, resulted in a lot of cutting. We had a couple of different paving patterns that would use the slot drain as a transition point between the patterns. In the oval court, we had a series of concentric circles, radial patterns, and some of those slot drains intersected each other, in some cases creating these very tight sliver pieces where we used a monolithic piece of stone and then put faux joints into it. Here's another example of where these two off-centered circle slot drains are coming to a feather point. The one particular pattern that we developed for this was a 12-piece random pattern. This stone, again, was from China and was water jet cut in China. And the different installers each developed their own method of handling this random pattern that wasn't really random. It was just a series of 12 pieces that repeated itself. There's a lot of paving on this job, a lot of different paving patterns, and again, the challenge of working through the winter. And you can see in this photo, there's those large boulders in the background. They need to trim those pavers to fit up against those boulders so that it looks like the boulder was there and we paved up to it. The whole idea here is the creek came first was the mantra of our client. We also had a couple of different edge conditions to the paving at different planters and water elements. We used monolithic stone for the stairs. Of course, those monolithic treads also had to be fit to the adjacent pieces. And we also had a hidden tree well detail that we developed so that the trees just pop right up out of the paving. This turned out to be a really successful application, and we've started to use this detail on other projects. The graphic designers on the project, once we heard we needed to try to discourage kids from climbing all over these boulders, developed this rather innovative sandblasting method to incorporate some signage. And they also had this idea of putting fossils, if you will, sandblasting fossils into the paving. And that led to footprints, and then it led to signage so that people could understand what these different things are. And each of the formal fountains has a little piece describing what they're called. And, of course, other regulatory type things like this private property sign and wayfinding elements were incorporated into the paving. All throughout the process on this project, there was great collaboration between the owners and the architects, the sub-consultants to the architects, the general contractor, all of the sub-consultants under the contractor, as well as close collaboration between the quarry and the fabricators. I don't know if any of you guys want to speak to some of the uniqueness of this job compared to other jobs that you've worked on as far as collaborating between different members of the team.
Well, I'll start with the fact that there's 5 of us actually here still talking to each other. So, that actually speaks to a lot of what went on this project. That at the end of it, there was a very good mutual relationship between each of us. There was give and take. I know from a KEPCO perspective that this isn't our typical project, and it was a steep learning curve for everybody. And I think the fact that we, I was going to say held hands, but that doesn't sound good. Ultimately, we did. We held each other's hands through this, and when people were stumbling along and not sure what we were going on, each of us had our own field of expertise where we'd bring that to that conversation. And I know Aaron and I, we'd meet on a weekly basis to discuss, okay, here's the list of the boulders we need on Monday, and here's what we need on Tuesday, and then by Wednesday we were already changing our minds. So there's a lot of camaraderie and there were times when it was stressful because we all had a schedule we had to meet, and we had budgets that we'd all set for each other, that we'd given the owner to do the job. So from a KEPCO perspective, working with all of these guys was amazing. And the quality at the end speaks for itself in the fact that all of our efforts paid good dividends. So I don't know what you guys got. Anything else you want to add? So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, for me, what made this project refreshing was once they settled in on what type of stone they were going to use, Ross invested the time to figure out what the quarry's capabilities were, and then at that point he designed around that. He's like he said earlier, he had these humongous flagstone pieces that were 2 inches thick and like huge by huge, and in all reality, our quarry doesn't yield that type of material, and so he listened to us, and they changed the design to work with the materials that were available. And that's not to say we didn't push it for what we...
And there was some back and forth. We kept asking for you to modify your quarrying techniques to find larger boulders. And you did. You were able to find some larger ones for us.
And then another huge challenge was the project took a huge amount of slabs, natural slabs in the creek bed. And so that was a challenge. We had to plan way ahead on that because our slabs we don't get a ton of them every year out of the quarry. So there's usually a line of people wanting them. So we had to plan way ahead on those as well.
Something else with, the boulder selection. They would come to the quarry and say, okay, we need boulders that are 6 by 6 by 4. So I would go find 3, 4 of those. Jeremy Ross would come out. We don't like any of those. Okay, instead of getting rid of them, I would move them aside, set them aside because they were good boulders that I still felt could be used somewhere throughout it. They would come out. Ross would have his little diagram about this big, and Jeremy hold it up towards the boulder and be like, that's not the right shape. But then they would come out the next morning and be like, oh, that was perfect for this.
It's because you turned it 90 degrees.
Because it was just a different angle. But it was great working with them on the fact that they were willing to listen, and not only listen, but work with what we actually were able and capable of doing. They were really great on that aspect. So.
Are there any questions?
As far as Cold Spring, I'll just speak for Cold Spring. The earlier we get involved, it's easier for us to execute on the vision that you have with stone. And also, our goal is always to eliminate as much as we can with any errors or work at the site. So I think those are the things and the collaboration was wonderful.
So I just want to speak to the fact that although we didn't have that much time on the actual project to construct the actual finished product, there was, if we hadn't had a year out in Heber to be able to actually produce this thing, it would never have happened in the time we allotted. So we always like to say we need a year from the day that we get an order to the day we install on most projects to do shop drawings and actually find the stone. And this project took longer. It really was. It was almost a year and a half between the day when we actually first met and discussed that there was these certain water features, particularly the natural ones. Like Kathy said, even with Cold Spring, it does take a while to get everything drawn, reviewed, approved, particularly when you have two clients that don't always agree with each other. So lead time for us was probably the biggest part of the whole project, and its success was actually having the time it takes to and not have to rush everything. It felt rushed, even though we had a significant amount of time. There were still times when we were under a lot of pressure to produce boulders on a daily basis, that because people wanted to review them and keep looking at the mock-ups as they were being built. So.
And I was involved with the project 2 years before it ever even bid. And so it was like, by the time they started to bid, it was one of those projects where you were thinking, are we done yet? But we hadn't even actually bid the project. And I remember during the bidding process, about a week before bid day, I invited all the installers to come up to our fabrication plant, and I went over our bid, because the way this project was complex enough and that each installer could do it their own way as long as they achieved the owner's results. And so our estimate was very a la carte. They could choose what size boulder. The boulder costs this much if you wanted to do this cut on that boulder, and it was very a la carte. So I wanted to help the installers be successful and understand the way we bid the project, and we brought them up. I had this U-shaped boulder all cut out and carved, and we were looking at it, and someone wanted to look underneath the rocks for some reason, and we brought a tractor over, and we were trying to maneuver it around, and the dang thing broke right in half. And I remember everybody going, well, now what are you going to do? And I was like, well, you need to understand that this is stone, and it can break, and you need to factor that in. And so I think it was a very realistic moment in the process, and helped the installers realize that, this isn't your typical run-of-the-mill project. We spent over a year every day with one of our 12-foot saws cutting on these cascades, and yet at the end of the day, you would never know we cut one of them.
Right. Yeah, all of the hard work's hidden behind, which I guess is a good part. I mean, the thing looks natural. Yeah. So, we'd like to open up the floor. Yeah, you have a question.
Congratulations, very difficult process.
Thank you.
Starting out, did you guys as designers get an open budget from the owner?
No. Initially we were not given a budget during the conceptual phase, and as we kind of locked in the direction that the owner wanted, we did do a DD estimate, and we did run into concern, but this project is the star project, the featured project, their baby for the LDS Church. And it did exactly what they wanted it to do. It has totally reinvigorated downtown Salt Lake City. The retail center is 95 or 98% occupied. In fact, that last storefront might be full by now. Their sales are breaking records. The first year, I shouldn't say all the shops, most of the big shops in this center, it's their most profitable location. And of course, I did mention how the public, they see this now as an amenity. They come here, they just hang out. Some of them shop, but a lot of them just hang out. It's just a place to be. And adding all this new residential to downtown has really invigorated downtown Salt Lake City.
But it was a hard bid. I mean, we all bid the design drawings from a fixed price perspective. So yeah, once the budget was set, it was set.
But I know at one point KEPCO came to me and basically was saying, hey, our price is too high, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I guess they should go somewhere else for their stone, because we have to make money. And they actually looked at a lot of other alternatives, and about 2 months later they came back and they says, okay, we're back, we're using your stone. So there was some time periods where I would say budget definitely caused some stress.
When the first DD budget came in, some of the ownership representatives, most likely the accountants, said, why don't we use faux boulders? Why do we have to pay for all these real boulders? Let's use fake boulders. And we actually did a little tour of a couple of different projects in the region. One of them down at, is it called Thanksgiving Point?
Yeah.
Yeah, which is like a 50-foot high, 120 foot long artificial rock wall. And we looked at it first from about 100 feet away, and it's like, well, that's not that bad. And then as soon as you got within 50 feet of it, it looks like man-made rock. And then you get really close to it, and you knock on it, and it doesn't sound right, and you see all this efflorescence. And right then and there, the owners group said, we're not doing this. This is going to be a lasting quality project in downtown that inspires all of the other people who are going to redevelop downtown to do something of quality, something of lasting value.
And I would bet that's why everything went good, is because ultimately they did approve the budgets of the teams that got the project, and every member of the team had the money in it to do what needed to be done, the way it needed to be done to create this world-class project.
Yeah. Another question? Go ahead.
Using projects of this size, you try to nail down some people inputting assets being done.
Right.
Were there hundreds of change orders?
No, there was about 30, 40.
Change orders?
For us,
some of them were quite
for
big.
us, the design team,
Right.
there were a little over 100 change orders, ad services from SWA.
I think Delta Stone only had like 4 or 5
Major, yeah. I mean,
ones.
because of the way it was priced, it was actually priced on a boulder size, not a shape or anything else. So there were like 4 categories of boulders, and then each one of those had a price to cut them. And it was our job as the installers to work out how many of those boulders we need and how many cuts we can do. That's how we bid the job. So once we knew the structure behind it, we could work out pretty accurately how many cuts we needed. The hard part for us was, to be honest, was the actual installation time. The mock-up was part of the original pricing, so we knew we had to do everything twice. So that helped.
Yeah, some of the ad services for SWA was due to the extensive use of mock-ups. We knew our standard specifications call for mock-ups of all these different elements, but usually it's a 3-foot by 3-foot or a 10-foot by 10-foot kind of mock-up. Here we were building the whole thing, the real thing, in a number of different circumstances, and that was much more time-consuming than we had anticipated. We hadn't programmed for that. And then also the boulder selection process. I remember the very first time that Jeremy called me up and he goes, "Yeah, let's start tagging some of these large, medium, and small boulders that go along the creek." And we went up there, and he pointed to about a 100-foot tall pile of boulders with, I don't know, a couple thousand boulders in it, and he goes, "All right, go pick them." And I was just like, what? And so it was a process of getting the quarry to kind of spread them out so you could, walk around it and get a sense of what it was. And it was every one of these boulders, like I said, we selected individually and became intimate to their different characteristics. Go right ahead.
Is there any issues over time with the pavement moving and the polymeric sand popping out and the sand getting in the drainage and having to resweep all the joists and all that?
We haven't had any problems with sand clogging up the drains, but unfortunately, that very first mock-up we did, that was a 50-foot long, 30-foot wide sample. When we first installed that, the property management group of Taubman that was going to be maintaining this mall, they were the ones who came out and started this conversation about which sealer to use. And so then we built that other mock-up to see which sealers would work. And during that whole process, we worked closely with the sealer manufacturers, with the polymeric sand manufacturers, and it was discussed over and over again the importance of not power washing with just any old power washer. The angle of the nozzle, how wide the fan of the nozzle is, the actual temperature of the water and the pressure of the water, these are all key things. And we developed a really tight spec on how to maintain these pavers. As soon as the project opened, they're just out there power washing like crazy. And they're blowing out that polymeric sand like nobody's business. And when I asked him, I said, "What happened?" And he just said, "You know what? We're not going to reapply the sealer. It's quicker and easier for us just to wash the stone." And I go, "What about the polymeric sand?" "Don't worry about it. When we have to, we'll either mortar set them or we'll reapply the polymeric sand." And in between each one of the stones, there's a spacer in addition to the sand. So even though half of that 2-inch layer of sand gets blown out, the pavers are still holding their position. Another aspect of that was this is all on structure, and it's only supposed to be technically for pedestrian use. We worked very closely with the architects and the owners about what type of equipment would be used to wash the windows, hang Christmas decorations, all that kind of stuff. And we finally got the equipment that they were going to use, and this was it. They sent us the data sheet, and it's like, that's a 9,000-pound vehicle. This is now a vehicular paving system. You can't do it, you know.
With a 20,000-pound weight load.
Exactly. And so the same thing. We developed 3 layers, or I can't remember if it was 2 or 3 layers, a 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch plywood was supposed to be put down before they drove out on this. And they're not doing that. In fact, I think Jeremy got a call yesterday that a forklift has driven over one of the pop jet fountain piece and has fallen through. And it's an ongoing thing. More questions? Yeah.
What do you guys plan for the issue for your joints? Type over the shrink as well?
That's
with the joints for which, sorry?
For like the cascade elements.
Oh, go ahead. There was a lot of discussion on that too, and in order to keep, if the joints were open in the cascades, it was just discovered that a lot of water traveled actually behind the water feature. So in order to make force the water to the front, we actually ended up caulking those joints with a water, a caulking element. Yeah. That can actually make.
And it's sanded, and it's not just sanded with one color of sand, and it's not one color of caulk. We ended up having, I think it was a palette or 3 or 4 different colors of caulk to make it disappear within these natural stone elements. And the sand was used to help get that sheen away, texturally make that blend in. I'm not aware of any issues yet. Yeah.
It looks good still.
Yeah. No, it's again, we tested it for adhesion, though. We tested it for, we went through the typical, just like we were going to caulk a high-rise building. We went through a whole set of tests to make sure that the adhesion, the stone, it didn't need primer and all those kind of things, so that, yeah, it's caulked just like it was, a 10-story or 15-story building. Then we went through that level of testing.
Yeah. In the back there?
Yeah, it's an amazing job. How do you deal with any contamination of the creek from outside sources? Is there a filtration? Because maybe things a little later on you spoke about that. How do you deal with just rainwater runoff, maybe overloading the system?
Yeah, again, we worked with CMS Fountain Consultants on all of the creek features and some of the formal features. WET was involved in the more interactive ones. And we also worked with an ichthyologist, a fish doctor, a fish expert. And there were a lot of criteria for the quality of the water as well as the temperature of the water in order for the fish to survive. And we also ran into a problem. That big cascade is next to a 2-story tall glass wall at the food court, and the concern of hard water staining on the glass was a big issue. And so there's actually 12 different fountain systems. It's not one system for the creek. It's broken up into different segments, although it appears as one continuous element. And the segment that has the water splashing onto that glass wall at the food court has got some inhibitors in it, and so we couldn't put fish in there. And we didn't think we could put plant material, but we went ahead and put some of the riparian plant material in there, and it survived for maybe a year. I think the first frost that came in, all the other material would go dormant and come back. That material just didn't make it. I think they are just kind of changing that out now on a regular basis to help soften it. And as far as the rainfall, that really wasn't an issue. There's overflows to adjust the water level, so it wasn't concerned there. The ichthyologist, he, in a number of meetings, great guy, really knows his fish stuff, but isn't real savvy around owners. And he
likes fish more than people.
He would tell these horror stories about kids are going to come out here and dump tide and, turn it into a big frothy thing and all the fish are going to die. And so we ended up, he put enough fear into the ownership group that one of the change orders was to design sensing systems. So there's a series of automated sensors that track the pH level and some other stuff with the water. And There's an alarm that will go off. The mall operator's cell phone will ring, and he'll call his guys, and they can rush down there. And they have a special basin set aside to put the fish in, so they could pull the fish out and then flush out the system and get the fish back in. So they did think about that.
Do you have to make up a lot of, to make up evaporation out of the water, or are you able to kind of?
I'm not sure what the evaporation rate is. Another aspect of this mall that was
shade most of the time.
Yeah, the Fish Creek portion. The fish are only inside one block and only inside the Galleria, and this is another battle between the residential developer CCRI, the LDS Church, and Taubman, the retail developer. The retail developer said, "Hey, this is Salt Lake City. We have to have an enclosed mall." And that's the only way it's going to work. You're not going to have shoppers out here when it's 12 degrees below zero and snowing. And the LDS Church said, no. We want to embrace nature, and we want to have it snow for our little seasonal Christmas parade and all these different things. And ultimately, a decision was made to put in two, well, I think they're the largest operable skylights this side of the Mississippi for sure. But each block, each half of this project has an operable skylight. And I can't remember what the hit was for that, but when we started the project, the numbers I heard was about 1.2 billion for the project. In the end, I think it was much closer to 2 billion for the full development. So the point on that was they closed the roof. It's actually a controlled space, temperature-wise, so that would help alleviate some of that evaporation. Any more questions? Yes.
I noticed there the bridges didn't have any handrails, some of the steps going down. Did you encounter any volatile discussions with the...
Oh yes. There are as far as along the creek goes, where we have the different types of bridges, and we had three different types. We had formal stone, random stone, and then we had the cast iron bridges that crossed the creek. And from a code perspective, the drop-offs were less than 30 inches. There's no need to even have a little curb on those, let alone a handrail. But, of course, there were many discussions about whether we need rails or not. And at one point, Taubman wanted to have handrails across both edges of the entire creek. And luckily, the smarter minds prevailed, and we were able to avoid that. Initially, there was lots of talk about how, that image of no climbing on the rocks, that the security guards there at the mall were going to be, out there slapping people's hands for climbing on the rocks. But in talking to the operations manager, after about a week, he said, you know what? Let them climb. It's not worth it, And another issue they have is some of the kids try to catch the fish, and they obviously can't. They don't succeed in that. And then there's a lot of displacement of some of the cobbles that we used along the banks of the creek because of the kids climbing down to interact with the fish. So that's actually one of the biggest complaints from ownership is they can't wait for the plant material to fill in so that it's less inviting for the patrons to go down by the water.
But
yes.
It's fun to see the people interact with the stone. I mean, I think there's a picture in there of a girl laying like almost on a lawn chair almost, or whatever you want to call it. And I mean, it's that way throughout the whole 1,300 feet of the block. I mean, there's just always people all over the stones.
It's a really pleasant space to be in. The subtle sounds of the moving water, especially on a sunny day. You get up on one of those rocks and it's all heated up, and it's turned out to be a really magical place.
The system shut down during winter time?
I'm sorry?
The system shut down during winter time?
No. All of the water features run year round. Yeah.
They're heated. The water, not for the fish area, but the other ones are heated.
Yeah, the fish area is actually cooled. In order to keep the fish alive, we need to have a chilling system for the fish habitat. And the big cascades, I've seen a couple of images during some of the dry run startups of the fountains. The heating element wasn't working, and it was really neat the way that the ice fall was created. Of course, it made the structural engineer really nervous to see the ice building up on that big cascade. Yes?
Have you had any, on the Chinese granite, it looks like some of the gold variety, have you had any oxidization or change in tone of that over?
You know, I have, the last time I was there was a year ago for the end of the 1-year warranty period, and there were a few stones that were starting to discolor, and they were doing a bunch of tests to try to figure out if there was moisture coming up from beneath. And I've talked to these gentlemen who live in Salt Lake, and they said that there's more and more of this discoloration that's starting to show up on that stone.
Yeah, they are having some discoloration issues, and they're also having some disintegration issues with the pressure washer and it being a lower grade granite. I guess they'll have to deal with it.
They are dealing with it. That just. Pardon?
Is it open on Sunday?
No, that's an interesting question. Yeah, that was another big battle with the retailer versus the LDS Church, was whether or not, and the facility is open to the public, but the stores aren't open. And
the food courts are open. The food's open.
Yeah. Another interesting part of that we played a little bit of a role in was, I can't remember, it's 600 or 600 foot radius from Temple Square, this one point on Temple Square, you can't serve any alcohol. And so the retailer really struggled where to put the restaurants that were going to serve alcohol, and we got drawn into that because of the outdoor dining associated with those restaurants. But again, this center is one of the most successful, and for many of the stores, the most successful location they have, even without those Sunday hours. Anyone else have any questions?
If you want to, there's a write-up in the BSI magazine. You can pick up a copy at the BSI booth down on the show floor. So a little shameless plug for the BSI, but...
He didn't say that.
Be a party there right after?
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Starts in 15 minutes.
And it's a great article. So
I also have some project cut sheets that just hit on some of the facts of the project. If anyone would like one of those, and just a kind of mini brochure if anyone's interested.
And feel free to come up and look at the moquettes. There's a piece of a small chunk of the Mountain Valley stone that was used for the boulders. There's just a piece of sawn Mountain Valley with the sandblast finish, just to kind of give you an idea of some of the different things in that sense that was provided.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, everyone. Appreciate you being here.